schedule in our program today. Minister Dux for Foreign Affairs and European and Foreign Affairs of the Catalan government will join us after this first session, so that it is that's at 11 a.m. we will have him delivering the speech. From 11 to 11:15 he will be with us, and then right after 11:15 we will do the break, right? So the break will come right after the minister's words. But before this, let me now give you the floor to the moderator of today's session, Angela Mauro, who will introduce also this session. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm the Brussels correspondent for HuffPost Italy, and it's a pleasure for me to present and moderate this session of this summer school. We have remotely connected from Brussels Member of Parliament Lucia Annunziata. I don't know if you know her. She's before being elected at European Parliament last year, she was a famous journalist, very popular in Italy. She had a TV program on the state TV. She has huge experience in foreign and international relations and politics. And in fact, now at European Parliament, she deals with defense, which is the main topic now for the European agenda, and foreign relations. Good morning, Lucia. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Buongiorno, Angela. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation.
So, okay, this session, as you know, is on EU foreign and security policy in southern neighborhood and conflicts, of course, because this region is unfortunately full of conflicts and instability. So we'll try to speak about the role of the European Union in this context and how the European Union is changing its approach to this region. You know that at the beginning of this mandate, the European Commission launched a new Directorate General, the DG MENA, which means Middle East and North Africa Directorate General. The objective, the aim is to look at the southern neighbor not just as a border zone, but as a strategic corridor in relation to a lot of topics, strategic topics, from energy to migration, climate, youth, environment. So for a start, Lucia, would you like to give us your overview on this changing approach by the European Union and your point of view on this? Thanks.
Thank you again, Angela. Thank you also for this question. It is a question that is not very much posed to anybody. The issue of policy, European policy vis-à-vis the South. But in truth, you know, the South, especially if by the South we consider the strategic position within the Mediterranean Sea, is very much in the mind, for instance, of this future rearmament plan that is discussed in Europe. Let me just go back a little bit. Today there are two strategic areas where war is expanding. It will be more and more a key point. One thing is the famous Big Blue. The Americans have been working on the issue of Big Blue for a long time, and it's the project of developing bigger and bigger ship with total military autonomy, like the big ship that, like the airplane carriers, they have become today, and in the future will be more and more a key point for the war, because at this point, moving the big ship from where The airplane can arrive and leave. That brings around almost 5,000–6,000 people. They have a complete and autonomous possibility to collect intelligence. It's like to have a moving army, a little town with everything self-sufficient to make war. In the Mediterranean, as you know, the Americans have had traditionally a big fleet of such type, except that the big fleet of American airline, the American have become larger and larger. And in fact, when we ever had, you could see the role of this big ship, for instance, in the Hormuz Strait, when there has been a first crisis with Houthi, we as a nation, we all send a type of military ship, but the American moved right away the biggest of all, the airplane carrier, which in the meantime metamorphs into something else. This is true also for the South Mediterranean, which is in fact, you know, patrolled by those big ships. And when there has been problem in Israel, the Americans also move outside the water of Israel a couple of those big ships. In general, you could see that this is a move in the military reorganization, because the policy of China of acquiring harbor and port everywhere in the from the Indian Sea down to the Mediterranean is another proof that we are going to move to a different type of war to control the sea. The control of the sea is a key point for, and that's why I'm starting from this, because I'm pleased with this question, because it's completely not considered, but it's very, very important military development and would be part of it. You know, Italy, for instance, will have, with the Corvette are a very small, very small and very flexible type of war support navy. And they are a specialty of Italian, for instance. They are selling even to the Americans. So behind all the discussion, there are those preparations, for instance. Now, the control of the sea is important because at the bottom of the sea, many things happen. Among other things, the passage of kilometers between one continent and another, of all the data and all the data we need, and also internet communication, etc. So the control of the sea, as you have seen this, proof of this also in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia recently. How many attacks have been tried against those transport of data on the side of Ukraine on one side and the side of Russia on the other part. Let me add also a few things on the other future land, this outland in this case, area of expansion of the war, and is the space. Everybody said the space is very important. Probably what we don't say very often, and should be known of the large public opinion, is that we are capable, we as human race, capable at this point to create satellites who are completely controlled by artificial intelligence, and they will be armed. So in the space we can imagine at one point clashes between armed and autonomously armed and generating its own work position by satellite against satellite. So I can stop here. Just wanted to give the importance of the South in this sense, because the fact that the Mediterranean is becoming a key point of control is a transformation, what we consider, you know, the tail of Europe. Sometimes geographically, that means Spain, that means southern Italy, etc., is going to make those two pieces, for instance, of those nations, and as well for Greece, etc., are going to make them, and they are already in the map, strategic countries.
Thanks, Lucia. As you deal, as you've been speaking a bit about this, as you deal with defense, which is the priority of this new European mandate started last year, how would you combine the plans, the European plans for defense, and specifically the rearm EU with this renewed approach to the Mediterranean? Do you think that there is a link, or do you think that the plan is still not mature enough to build a real European defense, and so it's not robust enough to be linked to the approach with the Mediterranean and the southern and eastern neighbors of European Union?
Well, I think that we have to a little bit think, in order to answer, Angela, I think we should go back to geography, no? Besides, there is a book out that is very interesting. It's called Prisoner of Geography. Like a human being can do a lot of things, but cannot change geography. Geographies are plain and mountain and chain of mountain and river and water and sea. Unfortunately, in Europe, we have done a lot of things, a lot of change, a lot of rearmament, but we're still on the same point. Like we have Western Europe, Eastern Europe, in the middle of Germany, that has been for ages, at least 2 centuries, been a domineering power in Europe because it was presiding over those lands that are flat land. Look at the flat land in Ukraine and how this has determined its fate on the invasion of Russia, and so is the issue of the Mediterranean. The issue of the Mediterranean is not only what I told you up to now, that means a new geopolitical space. The Mediterranean is also the connection between Europe and Middle East. And we have seen this chemical at work in this war. When Ukraine, the first war in 80 years on European land started, a lot of people say, okay, this will be a new kick to starting sort of a new phase and more decisive clashes in Middle East. And sure enough, everybody got involved. First, I must remind you that Iran decided to side with Russia. And then, the ambiguous situation with the ambiguous role, by key role of switching one part or another of Turkey. And finally, the infection went down to the proper Middle East, which is Israeli-Palestinian. Now, it's true that everything that was event started with October 7th, which, we have to condemn forever for what it has done, of course, to not only to the people of Israel, among other things, people attacked in October 7th, were the colonists who stayed in Arab territory. So they were friends of the Arabs. But, that's not the point only. That was the thing that needed to start again a brewing fire. Because, war are, like military people love to say, they travel like earthquake under the skin of our land, and they find crack, and they communicate with each other with crack. The European attack on the European war of Ukraine, the invasion of Putin, somehow it moved again the Middle East. So I think this is the problem we have. Europe, despite everything, cannot be isolated. Even though we try to close Europe within the idea of one big new continent, in fact, we are definitely attached to Asia, definitely attached to Middle East, and definitely attached to the sea, to Africa. So this is the new dimension of the war. And I think the rearm somehow I would like to get there because I think on the rearm, Angela, also we have a lot of things to explain. It's not finished, the proceeding of designing and writing the rearm, but I think we should start to think, and I'm aware of it because I'm there every week at the Defense Committee and the Foreign Committee, because those two, Foreign Affairs and Defense, now they have joined again, and unfortunately the agenda of the Foreign Affairs are more and more defined by the defense program. So the things we should consider now, it's not what the things will be doing for this connection, because it's undone, but how the rearm of Europe will affect 5 years from now, 4 years from now, on these areas we are connected to politically, geographically, and in terms of interest. I'm telling you right away, I'm not a militarist, I'm not even a pacifist. I think that war is a technical disgrace. It's like the hugest accident on a big highway that you cannot control. You know, it doesn't matter how much. It's a technical failure inside the development of history. So I'm in favor, certainly, of defense, because citizens need security. But I'm against, for instance, the craziness of unregulated rearmament. And unfortunately, the second option, despite what Europe is saying now, over and over, is taking us in this direction.
Thank you. You're saying, I mean, the EU is not isolated. You've been speaking about the rearmament.
I don't hear you well, Angela.
I was quoting you. You were saying the EU is not isolated because we are very close to some strategic areas of the world and the sea as well. And you've been mentioning, of course, and speaking about the rearm EU and defense. But the EU, okay, is changing its approach to the Mediterranean.
Angela, unfortunately, I cannot hear you.
I try again. Can you hear me now?
There is no sound. There is no sound. It's
no
not
sound.
The problem. There is no sound.
I'm asking if they can do something. Wait a minute. Okay, shall I try? Can you hear me now? No?
Hold on a second. I think we are experiencing some...
Maybe it's there.
You know, whenever you talk about rearmament, something happens. It's just a word.
It's just a word that blocks everything.
A disgrace.
Can you hear me now? No. No? No.
Nothing. I can see you though.
Okay.
You can talk sign.
I can.
We are trying to do something though.
Yeah, also here. I hope they solve the problem. Unfortunately, I can't do the language. I don't know. Should I keep on speaking? Okay, can you, is there any difference now? Can you hear me? No. No.
We are working on something, but I don't know what it is. The problem is switch me to another post. Should I?
The powerful means...
I'm moving.
Okay. I think it's their problem, yeah. Well, you can use this time to think of your questions, if you haven't done it already. Okay. Lucia, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
A little bit lower the noise. There is too much noise. A little bit
Yeah,
lower
because they
the
were-
volume. See, Angela, you think?
You can't
Okay.
see me. You can,
In
okay.
1 second you'll be on, but in the meantime, maybe you can ask me a question.
Yeah,
because
yeah, in the meantime, I can
hear.
ask you the question. Okay, you were saying that EU is not isolated. You were speaking about the rearm EU and the plans for defense, which is a priority for this new mandate. But at the same time, Europe is not developing a common foreign policy, which is, I think, directly connected to a defense policy, and is not taking action on, well, on Ukraine, yes, but now there is a difficulty of the US cutting funds, maybe not, maybe yes. Donald Trump is always changing his mind on Kiev, but for sure on the Middle East, which is a crisis you were mentioning before. EU is not able to take action or to be there, to play a role in that crisis. What's your stance on this?
Well, this is obviously what is happening, and it's so obvious, Angela, that for the first time, even within those walls, I'm here on the 3rd floor of the European Parliament building. Even on this floor, I say this has become some sort of a common truth, you know. For a long time, every time, anytime Europe was attacked, there was always like locking arm and say, no, this is not true, it's something that has happened, but we are working on this. At the moment, there is a total silence on many aspects of the failure of Europe, like Palestine and Gaza is one thing, but also Ukraine is another, you know, and actually first Ukraine and then Gaza and then Ukraine back. I think that we have reached the limit of, I don't know if people is listening to me, agrees with me, I don't even know what you think about this. I think that Europe is built like a dysfunctional system. A dysfunctional system that was exactly the system I suspect the founders wanted, because as you know, the founders were all children of Nazi and fascism. And so they didn't want to have a democracy in a way that was straight on. Like if you win the first level, then like Mussolini and Hitler, they both, remember, they were elected according to the system at the time. They were legitimate by election. So in a way, this has, like many democracy, a step inside that you had to cover all in order to have something that functions with the same voice, meaning parliament, and then commission, and then head of government, right? Those three levels, in truth, you have been covering for a long time, they are not necessarily can be allied, and in this moment, they are not. Like the European Parliament are, for a tiny majority, been voted while there was still some majority in European Parliament, various European Parliament of center-left, or left. All the rest of the election have been all turning right, the different nation. And the Commission, so the Commission has a majority of center-right. I use the center because center here, you know, and I think that people who are present there should know, in center is a very ambiguous word in EU. You never know where center is. You know, the right wants to have its own center, the left wish to have its own piece of center, and the center that means fundamentally PPE, you know, Partido Popular, and plays sometime one part more and more on the right, sometime on the other part less and less the left. So this is the first problem. We don't have a sheer majority in the parliament. But when we go up at the commission is a majority on the right, and the government has consequence in the right. So you know what happened? That we can, doesn't matter what we try, doesn't matter what we try, there has never been a majority in the past months of crisis. In Ukraine more, but on Gaza and Israel completely no majority, split totally parliament on this. So the result is that the parliament is paralyzed. The famous idea that you cannot vote on absolutely majority, you know, on total majority, total consensus, it has exploded itself, and especially on the issue of Middle East, of Israel and America, of course, it has brought this government to a standstill. Now, this is my experience. When I arrived a year ago, this is my first experience, you know, so, and I was a journalist, so even though I have covered foreign policy and politics all my life, in reality, I did not know anything about this. I thought it was a normal institution, but it is not, you know, and it's changing and continue to change. And what I say at, we don't have, parliament is less and less important. I just anticipate something I'm sure will come up. There is a rule, the 122, that allows the parliament to be bypassed if there is a matter to discuss of urgency. Now, the matter, this 122, in all the previous legislature than this one, is been called 5 times. In this legislature, has been called already 8 times. For me, as a journalist, it's a fact good enough to know that the parliament is on the way to disappear in terms of voices. And this is one of the dramatic things. For instance, I've been writing EDIP. EDIP is fundamentally the pocket where we have put a lot of money and all the rule, what to produce, where to buy, with what transparency, and it was a good job. It was a good job where the parliament somehow, right and left, managed to have an agreement. But of course, it's not pleased. The top level is not pleased because there are, for instance, too many rules. And one of the things that will be asked for this, when the approval, the vote will be, which it will be soon, now and in September, will be to cancel all sorts of rules. For instance, Kubilius has already called, not officially, but it has already called for a total process of deregulation. Now, you understand what it means, deregulation? I think all of you knows that this is one of the big problems of democracy. No regulation, like the idea floating around is that for the approval of contracts, of each contracts, each of them can be done in a different way. So it's a sort of a nightmare of rule that we have. So the regulation, because the industry, the rearmament must be fast. And from a point of view, you know, military point of view, this is true, it's fast. So in order to make this process fast, there would be just 60 days, 2 months for whoever needs to approve this, national authority, probably the commission, etc., 60 days to approve it. After 60 days, 2 months, there is no answers. Would be applied the rule silence consensus, equivalent to consensus. Now, this is a nightmare because are we sure that we can vouch that every contract will be done, it's something done in good faith, with the solid company, etc. The fact that the parliament will have no voice on this, will not see those contracts, is something that we cannot accept. And this is generating an enormous split, an enormous potential war within the parliament here, where I'm sitting, you know. There are a big name, a big important people who run this parliament, who are already in a very short terms with each other. I'm not going to give a name, otherwise, I think we anticipated too much of a part of a conflict. I don't know if I've answered enough.
Yeah, and you have anticipated my next question on the Article 122 and the decision to exclude the Parliament from the discussion on defense. So you're saying big fights inside the Parliament, or you mean also, I guess, between the Parliament and the Commission, and what can be done on this situation to, I know that Metzola is doing something on behalf of all political groups, because everybody is affected by this exclusion. Do you think there is something more which can be done to, apart from telling people, because maybe people, I don't know, not everybody is aware of this decision to approve the rearm EU without any discussion inside the Parliament, because it is considered an emergency law, an emergency proposal. Do you think, sorry Lucia, I'm repeating it because I agree with you, it's important, it's an important concept, and it's good that people are aware of this, because people are the ones who are affected by this, because the European Parliament is the institution we elect directly, because we elect the MAPs. Lucia, do you think there is something more which could be done by the parliamentarians, the Parliament, I don't know, the political groups, to give an alert, a stronger alert on this situation?
Well, Angela, before I answer, I want to repeat my position on all those issues. I am in favor of a strategic independence of Europe. I am in favor of strengthening our defense, because we live in a world that has changed. And three, I'm in favor of the fact that we have asked too much. We have been too dependent on America, and it's the right time for us to take our, our destinies in our hands. So when I'm criticizing many aspects of this rearm, is because I think it's evolving in a way that is completely not controlled. Weapons are a very powerful thing, and I've been covering war all over. When a weapon enters into a room, the atmosphere changes. Imagine a rearmament entering into Europe. There will be a huge, and we even see some of this, huge rewriting of the balance of power within Europe. I think you understand that, The same way that this thing has already affected the relation between Parliament and the Commission inside, it has affected inside the Parliament also relations between committee, like a certain committee are not of interest anymore, like the traditional, the one that were the jewel of the crown, like transition, right? There is no money for that. There is no point. Europe has little money. So the question is, I believe that we should go toward a common defense that is not necessarily wild rearmament. For doing this, you need to have a certain rule, not to block it, but to control, for instance, participation of private capital joined with the state capital. Cannot be really controlled. So what do we know about those companies that will run to participate for joint ventures? Do we know something? We don't have a possibility. Those are, those are private companies. One of the big interests here at the moment is the idea that money will come also from a Wall Street profit, like from the market per se. So American funds are very interested in this moment to return over here and to invest on those issues. Now, I never think bad of anything and anybody, but I prefer, since among other things I'm a parliamentarian, to know the rule. So this is an important thing. It's possible to have a rearmament that is feasible. What I don't want is an unfeasible rearmament, and maybe it will be all right, but if the Parliament cannot even see the paper, we'll never be sure. Okay? you know, there are so many things that can go wrong. So excluding the parliament means also taking tremendous responsibility over there. So now you ask, what can we do? On paper, we can do something. We can ask the parliament to react. And in fact, the people interested on not ruling out the parliament are many. I myself, I presented 4, and I was part of the group that was writing the things, the EDIP, the rule. I presented 4 amendments even before we start writing, and they were accepted out of 1,600. There are parliamentarians who are doing, you know, lobbying on this issue. And the President Metsola has been courageous to raise it because, you know, Metsola and von der Leyen are part of the same party. Now, many people say probably this thing will go nowhere because where is the court that would say yes or no? You know, I mean, obviously, and I can see that you understand that. But bolder things can be done, bolder. Like Hugo, we cannot have a majority in terms of state. Not even, we don't have a majority, we don't have the absolute consensus of all the member states to do a thing. But you can have an individual request from individual parliamentarian or from every group, starting from the Patriots down to the Green, that can sign for this. It's difficult because, you know, here the parliament doesn't speak with each other. But this is the only way. It will be important that people up there start saying, we have elected those people, they represent us, we want answers, because we don't have the strength for this. You should know, we do not have strength.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. I think we can open the Q&A question, and I think there are a lot of points of inspiration for you. So who wants to start? It's your occasion now. I've been told you're, you know, usually who participates, and there are a lot of people. I don't know, Lucia, if you can see but
no,
the room is
I can
full.
see only you.
Okay,
but
sorry for you. But anyway.
So you can make faces.
There are a lot of participants. Okay, we have the first question.
Sí. Hola, good morning. I don't speak English fluently. Lo haré en castellano. Señora Lucía.
Perfect, I understand Spanish.
Señora Lucía, este año conmemoramos en Europa el 75 aniversario de la declaración de Robert Schuman, de la que se habla poco. Europa se fundó, yo no había nacido entonces, se fundó pensando en la solidaridad y en contra de la guerra. Parece que ahora estamos en lo contrario, estamos pensando más en la guerra que en la solidaridad. Yo creo que nos estamos equivocando. Señora Lucía Annunziata, ¿puede ser el principio del fin de Europa, hablando tanto de la guerra? Perdón, gracias.
No, but
I think she's on.
Should I answer?
Yeah, go. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you for reminding me and everybody's Schuman Declaration, but I say twice what is my position, because I think in moments so difficult of choice, nobody should hide what they think. I believe that it's possible to have a common defense, which is not real, but only if citizens take over that this is a serious issue. I don't know what is the perception. In Italy and Spain, there is a lot of disagreement with any talk about weapon. And I think in the same way. At the same time, I'm afraid. I'm afraid because I've been to Ukraine. I'm afraid because I know the Middle East. I can see that the situation are unfolding. So I think we should not become, rearm, bomb. I don't think. But I think there is a possibility for citizens of Europe to ask, to be wise, to control what the government decide, to understand first citizen and then government. I would not be, for instance, again, now I think you kick me out of it because it's irresponsible to say, a referendum about rearmament, I don't think they will give it to us because they need to be very fast. Ammunition is short, the peace in Ukraine is very difficult to resolve. There is no time anymore from a military point of view. So I think in this situation, could this be the end of you? You know, you put your finger on the right question. We all are afraid of it. And unfortunately, if you have a solution, you tell me. Angela has my number, and everybody can reach me as a parliamentarian. I'm here. I do nothing else. I moved my family here. We all moved together. And so there has never been a situation as dramatic. And I am literally afraid. Because have you seen, before I started telling you how the war goes underneath, and we have Ukraine, and then we had Gaza, and then we had the Iran, you know, the fire is out there. We also have to think of this.
Next question. Okay, there is a, yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. My name is Sanda, I'm from Moldova, and my question will be focused more on the hybrid threats. Lately, we've seen that the territory of European Union is also under attack. So we see that there are cyber operations, there is FIMI, disinformation. We saw on the news that there are drones that are flying, for example, in the territory of Germany, that are trying to surveil some military objectives in Germany. So I was wondering, what is your perspective on the response of the European Union towards the hybrid threats that are on the territory of the EU, and whether their response is comprehensive enough, whether it's necessary to do a little bit more in order to ensure the resilience of the European Union, but also how do we speak with our own citizens to inform them about the threats that are happening on our territory, but also to, indeed, I think the raising resilience and strengthening the security should be one of the core objectives, which it is right now, but probably it needs more discussion with people all around Europe, because in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, the understanding is a little bit different than in the Central or in the Eastern Europe, which are facing some of these hybrid threats more directly than the other parts of the EU. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to answer because I forget if I hear too many questions, then I bungle up everything. Thank you for this question because you raised one issue that is really decisive in this situation. Like Europe, that seemed to us very much united, in fact, has broke up again on the issue of Ukraine, dividing along a vertical line between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. You see, Angela, these things has never been mentioned because a lot of things are happening here that we Europeans thought that were just behind us. But all of a sudden, Europe has been woken up by many things that thought they were in the back, you know, were in an armoire, was our history, etc. But that's, for instance, one point. The person who has asked me, I apologize if I don't got your name right, so I don't want to make a mistake, remind us that they're afraid, they're under attack. And they're also rightly offended when we say, we in Western Europe, we say, oh, I mean, what's the point? Putin will never get to Paris. But of course Putin is not going to get to Paris. But the point is that Moldova and Poland and the Baltic places are Europe. Wake up, Europe, our brothers and sisters, no? But you have two different perceptions of urgency and fear. And I think we should address this. We should definitely address this. So we need more courage from our people that run this place, not in terms of more weapon, more this, more that, more integration, for instance, because of course now we have reopened a few processes of integration, like the Western Balkan. Why did we do this? Because Putin has a big still presence and influence in the Balkan. For instance, we are trying as Europe now to have reinforced partnership with the Middle East country. We haven't done anything, but for instance, we signed a key reinforced, like joint military and intelligence beside the human aid, which we already give, to a key, small but very key point country, Jordan, you know, and we are trying now to get back to Africa. So from this point of view, we are ready to take on more responsibility. But the point is that we have first things consolidate this relationship between East and West and talk about. This is why I'm here. Citizens have to have their voice speaking up. It's not me, you know, and it's not you. Journalists or media or social, they're not enough. So I think you're right. I think, but your intervention was important because it emphasized how different is Western Europe from Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Next question.
Good morning. Sorry, I thought I misunderstood because I thought the conference was more focused on the south of Europe, and I feel that we are not speaking about the south of Europe or the threats on the south of Europe. Could you talk a bit about this, please?
Well, yes, I think, you know, the first part of the issue of the Mediterranean, North Africa and Middle East, as, which is Southern Europe, was part of my speech in the first question. And it has to do with becoming a geopolitical, a new geopolitical area that is fundamentally, you know, part of, it's not more isolated from Europe as big, because Europe somehow is a Central Europe considered. So I think that part, it was, you know, sketchy, like it was the new drawing of Europe somehow, but I think I have an answer to this. Speaking of Europe dividing in north and south, on the other end, as I say right now, it's no more the division. Europe is divided between, in this moment, by perception, living condition, fear, hope, vertically, between East and West. It's like, you know, somehow the big wall never fall. You know, when you go down to the bottom of a dramatic situation, you have the sensibility of the Eastern Europe and the sensibility of Europe completely different. And I think this include, in this moment, Italy and Spain are part of Western Europe. They've been always. Even in terms of the end of the Second World War, they are part of the same group of people that saved Europe, that was saved by the American, by, you know, a sort of whole group of decisions. So I think that this is as much as we want to talk about this thing, because if you don't have a clear, the changing of the drawing of the influence and importance of issues in Europe, all Europe, I don't think we can take only the southern decision unless, as a part of what I say, you know, the connection and the sea has, on the other hand, listen, when you say that what is happening in the Middle East is the result of the war in Ukraine, what else there is to say about connection Southern Europe? Southern Europe has proved over and over during the last 3 years of a conflict that it's a part of a conflict. It doesn't matter how much you think this out, it's part of the conflict. It can go only worse.
Wait for the microphone.
I was having in mind some threats coming from Northern Africa, the Sahel, and so on. Should we not keep up our defenses in that way too? Are there any threats coming from there, Libya, Sahel, and down there? Which would be the south for me.
Well, if you want to talk about Southern Europe, technically, it is not, those areas have a power in their own, identity in their own, they are part of a different geopolitical game. The only connection between those countries and Europe is immigration, which is a big issue, but here we're talking about war. Certainly the immigration will be part of the war, but it's wrong to say that those countries are at the south of Europe. They are not.
Okay? Well, no, because otherwise she can't hear you. Yeah. Go on, please.
Sorry. From what I read, I was meaning from the south, not from the south of Europe, no, from the part...
The North Africa.
The North Africa is the southern part of Europe. It's a southern threat to Europe. Is there any threat? Are there any threats coming from the south? So there is no threats from the east, no? From Ukraine?
Yeah.
The question is from the Sahel?
Yeah, but you have changed a little bit the threat coming from this area is different from defining this area as this area as decisive in terms of south. Obviously, you know, it's a threat, but it's a threat of the pressure on those areas from two big countries. One is Russia, you know that Russia is very important in North Africa, and the other one is China. The threat of China there is not geopolitical, but certainly in terms of the dominion. So I'm just trying to explain to you why I divided my speech in this way, because I think South, one thing is calling what is the space, the geopolitical space of Southern Europe, and another thing is having a connection through this new geopolitical space with North Africa. But I consider Africa a land of conquer at this moment, but Africa a continent that should be considered by itself. Otherwise, we make a huge mistake, and among other things, we humiliate, once again, as Europe, everything that starts from North Africa down to Africa.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. Do you have other questions? Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your speech. As you are from Italy, I wanted to ask, how do you feel or how do you think about Giorgia Meloni's Protocolo de Entendimiento from externalization of migration? As we have seen, we tend to securitize migration and think of it as a threat. And how do you see that? Do you think the future of European Union is to externalize migration, that we can replicate send migration to third countries like Albania, or it's just a moment and a precisely moment like populism, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you know, I'm part of a political family that is definitely against, it has been very vocal, the Italian parliament on the left against this project. And a large, so am I. European is going to have more and more issue with the immigration and the way it deals with it. While in America it has exploded and has been a tool for Trump to rise, and in other countries of Europe there has been, you know, an important unbalance on this issue that has had weight on the result, the switch to the right. I think Europe, in many ways, Western Europe is still on the, you know, on the brink of deciding. What Meloni did was in a small portion, in a small, you know, in reduced dimension, something that has been always a dream of every country in Europe. Take those people, bring it back to a third country and leave it there, you know. In this sense, it's really, really, really unacceptable. So in Europe, there is no decision. There is a tendency about it, but on the other hand, there is another tendency in Europe too, and Italy is clear on it. We don't have people that work in the industry anymore. Maybe we will not need in 10 years because, I don't know, maybe the robot will do the miracle, but the truth is that we are short of people for many, many work, and the change in the future to more technological work will give a different, more and more different sense of utility to the immigration. So I'm not afraid of this issue. I'm afraid of the fact that people continue to address this issue now with the same mentality of when Europe had large empires everywhere. So this is what Europe has to disconnect itself from. We are not more to the time of empire. It's gone by. I know America has decided to think in this way, and for me, this is one yet another reason not to be with America in this moment and think of a strategic independence, which is a good defense independence too.
Thank you. We have time for other questions. Almost 10 minutes. I'm sure you have something else to ask. Yes. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your speech. I would like to know how can we explain citizens in countries like Spain how they have to perhaps receive less money for welfare state in order to increase budget in defense, for example. Thank you very much.
Well, you should not be put in a position to explain that. This battle has not been won yet. You know, there is enough resistance in this apartment, in this, how you say apartment, it's interesting, in this building, to this point. The battle is still going on, and I think in order to explain, you should explain before, not when the decision has been taken. We are not just standing still on these issues. There are a lot of decisions that are taken step by step, and in the parliament, there is at least, you know, there is a split on this. So I think it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and we are with you. But if the parliament is going to be cut completely out, nobody will have, it doesn't matter what we say, it will not be important. And if also this plan to take the parliament off this discussion succeed, I still think that the citizens of Europe should express their opinion. You know, you're not without voices, and this is an important thing. This is part of the discussion going on. When I say that it's possible to make a rearmament that does not change the value of democracy, it means that. And it means the control of the citizen, transparency, and be sure that what you do is not done for money, it's done for security, real security to various countries.
Thank you. Yeah, one more question, yes.
Gracias por su conferencia, muy interesante. Creo que en otra ocasión una conferencia como la suya debería estar acompañada de un mapa, porque no sé si todo el mundo que está aquí, cuando usted hablaba del Mediterráneo sur, norte, este y oeste, podíamos tener en la cabeza exactamente lo que quería decir, pero muchas gracias. Quería preguntarle, a raíz de la última pregunta que ha hecho la compañera, ¿cómo se ve desde el Parlamento Europeo la posición del presidente español, que al parecer ha quedado un poco solo en el tema del armamento, de rearmarse, etcétera, etcétera? Y el presidente Sánchez hizo una propuesta importante en la reunión de la OTAN, que tuvo lugar hace unos días, Nosotros sabemos lo que dicen los periódicos y tal, pero no sabemos lo que se opina desde el Parlamento. Me gustaría saberlo, si nos puede hacer un pequeño resumen. Gracias.
Well, as I described to you, the Parliament is divided, neatly divided, I would say. For instance, the Italians have appreciated always the position of Premier Sanchez, and of course it will have a big influence also on the position of the Parliament, this decision, the decisions you are taking. So Spain is very well respected in this Parliament. It has a very large group of people, very good, very, very active. It has a lot of influence. Of course, it's almost a solitary position, the Spanish one. You could see also in all the events Europe held, Spanish is on its own. But on the other hand, aren't you king-like population? You know, Spain has always played a big role, maybe individual, maybe outlandish, but always have had influence. So what I'm saying is that on decision issues like this, it's more important that the nation has a strong opinion and is capable to lead with the strong opinion that winning a majority. You know, this is the beauty of politics. If you have a majority, you win for sure, but if you're a minority, you can have a strong opinion. And that makes an influence on all the other protagonists of politics.
Maybe another quick question, because at 11 we have to close.
And I need the coffee.
Thank you so much. Really interesting to hear your opinion about it. I wanted to come back to maybe this, what we see now, this approach of Europe being more on its own without America, and also like to get back to the topic of migration, because in recent years, the EU has increasingly relied, I would say, on externalizing their border control, for example, to countries like Libya. And what we see there is that both like Frontex as the EU organization for the southern border control, but also these third-party actors have faced serious allegations of human rights violations, and including like things like illegal pushbacks or well, maybe we could say cooperation with militias as well. And to what extent do you think this security-driven approach, I would call it, undermines kind of the EU's credibility as a promoter of things like human rights and the rule of law, especially in the eyes of the global south, maybe, and like the countries of the MENA region? And could this kind of damage the EU's long-term geopolitical standing and its ability to build like trust-based partnerships beyond its borders, especially if we think about us as being this promoter of these kind of values, and in regards to what China does in Africa and like the EU playing a serious role there.
So I have to cut, otherwise we don't have time for the answer. Thanks. Lucia, please.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I repeated what I said at the very beginning, you know. Certainly there is a sense of a failure on a foreign policy issue. The human rights Gaza violation have the proof of everything that is lacking and is not working in the system. On the other hand, as I said at the very beginning, there is a system that works like this. It has to do with majority. And the majority are not aligned. And the result of a deep division between right and left, especially on those issues in Europe, are a proof that even the Parliament, the European Parliament, is deeply divided. So, yes, is it pleasant? No. Are we happy with this? No. But it's also an issue that we have to consider, not just like a moral duty and It's something we had to resolve, within ourselves. Also on this, I think it should be interesting to hear your voice, because very often the question of human rights becomes an issue of sensibility and decency. No, the issue of human rights are an economic issue, identity issue, and political issues. So maybe I will tell you, you ask us what we can do, and I tell you where we are failing. But I think also all people involved on the issue of migration and human rights, etc., should elaborate also a more complex answer, not just say, oh, you failed, you haven't done this, you haven't done this. Let's get together and just refine how we can make legislation that are very tight on the issue of respect to human rights. What about that?
Okay, thanks Lucia, thanks for your intervention and speech. I'm sure everybody appreciates. Have a good day in Brussels. We are here in Barcelona, which is maybe better. And I welcome Jaume Duck, which is the former spokesperson, I remember him very well at the European Parliament and now Minister of European Affairs here in the region of Catalonia. Now we are listening. Please, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Goodbye, thank you.
Bé, moltes gràcies. Thank you very much, Angela, for chairing this session with MEP Annunziata. Benvolgut conseller, moltíssimes gràcies per ser aquí. Sabeu, hem hagut de fer un petit canvi en l'horari previst, però en tot cas, i crec que parlo en nom de les tres organitzacions que estem darrere d'aquest curs, les oficines del Parlament i de la Comissió Europea aquí a Barcelona i també, evidentment, del CIDOB, com a organitzadors del curs, doncs crec que estem molt contents que en aquesta 5a edició d'aquest curs, que ja ha pres velocitat de creuer, puguem comptar amb la presència del conseller Duch i també d'haver-ho pogut fer el primer dia del secretari d'Estat Sant Pedro. Per tant, és mostra de l'interès que genera aquesta activitat, però també del compromís, en aquest cas, de la Generalitat de Catalunya i del Ministeri d'Assumptes Exteriors amb aquesta activitat. Per tant, conseller, la paraula és teva i després farem una pausa. Moltes gràcies.
Molt bé, doncs bon dia. Gràcies, Paul. Buongiorno, Angela. Contento di vederti qui a Barcelona. Gràcies, per descomptat, al Parlament Europeu, a la Comissió i al CIDOB, primer per convidar-me a aquest últim dia d'aquest curs, d'aquesta escola d'estiu. Sofía Corradi, 5a edició. Com deies, efectivament, això vol dir que s'ha consolidat. Enhorabona. Els qui ho heu fet possible, recordo molt bé els primers moments d'aquesta escola, que es consolida com una trobada, com una cita de l'any important per tenir la possibilitat de participar en un espai de discussió i de coneixement, de reflexió sobre el moment que viu la Unió Europea. Cada any escollint temes diferents i he vist que aquest any temes no en faltaven i de fet és normal perquè aquests últims mesos està molt clar que vivim una acceleració de la política internacional i també del propi, diguem-ne, esdevenir de la Unió Europea. Jo crec que és important analitzar el paper d'Europa en el món d'avui i és important que es faci amb activitats com la vostra. Aportant cadascú la seva mirada i jo el que faré ara durant els propers minuts és aportar la meva, que d'alguna manera també, lògicament, és la del govern de la Generalitat. Vivim en un món de moltes incerteses, jo crec que això s'ha repetit últimament moltíssim, però penso que també hi ha certeses, que també hi ha coses de les quals n'hem d'estar convençuts i ens les hem de repetir probablement de tant en tant a nosaltres mateixos. La primera em sembla que és òbvia, vivim en un món, en canvi, més complicat que mai. Estem tancant un període de 80 anys en els quals més o menys tothom sabia què és el que s'havia de fer, amb qui s'havia de fer i com s'havia de fer. Aquest període de temps s'ha tancat, ara vivim amb això que els anglesos, els anglosaxons diuen uncharted waters, no acabem de saber ben bé cap a on hem d'anar, o si ho sabem, no sabem encara exactament quin és el camí, perquè les referències ja no ens serveixen tant com servien abans. Podríem dir, simplificant molt, tot això va començar el 20 de gener amb el principi de la segona presidència del president dels Estats Units, del Donald Trump. No ho crec. Jo no crec que aquesta sigui la causa, jo crec que aquesta és una de les conseqüències, però sí que penso que en tot cas és un accelerador dels canvis, un accelerador del caos, ho podem veure de dues maneres diferents, però en tot cas és cert que des del gener les coses van més ràpides i cada vegada una mica més desordenades. En el sentit contrari del que hauríem imaginat que podia ser o que hauria d'haver estat al principi del segle XXI. Amb un afebliment del dret internacional, de les pròpies relacions internacionals tal com les coneixíem, del paper dels organismes internacionals, del món dels acords, del món de buscar el diàleg, del món d'anar trobant a poc, diguem-ne, camins comuns per una part important dels països. El que primen en aquest moment són els autoritarismes, cada vegada més, i d'alguna forma també una política que sembla basar-se o tornar a basar-se en l'enfrontament. De vegades en l'enfrontament dialèctic, de vegades en el veritable enfrontament. Amb això es debilita també la democràcia i les xifres ens ho diuen clarament. En aquest moment, avui, no més d'un 7% de la població del món viu amb autèntica democràcia. No parlo de països pretesament democràtics, parlo de llocs on realment es pugui dir que hi ha democràcia plena. Fa uns pocs anys era el doble, era el 12%, per tant estem, diguem-ne, en un camí de regressió prou evident. Fora d'Europa, fora de la Unió Europea, però també a dins de la Unió Europea, i últimament hem vist casos molt concrets de retallades de llibertats que fa uns anys semblaven assegurades. Segona certesa, penso, i és que davant d'aquests canvis la Unió Europea és més necessària i és probablement més important que mai. Igual que es va crear fa 70 anys perquè era, o es va pensar que era la millor manera de consolidar la pau i la democràcia després de la Segona Guerra Mundial, jo penso que ara, si no existís aquesta Unió Europea, l'hauríem de crear o l'hauríem de tornar a crear exactament pel mateix, en el fons, per defensar aquesta pau i per defensar aquesta democràcia. Tercera certesa, no som prou conscients del que tenim, no som prou conscients del que som o del que representem en aquest món actual. Som els europeus encara avui una de les regions més pròsperes del planeta. Som probablement una de les poques, no l'única, però de les poques regions que combinen, que són capaces de combinar el progrés econòmic amb el benestar i amb el respecte dels drets i de les llibertats democràtiques. Però tot això és el que avui d'una manera o d'una altra està en perill. Ja prou amb donar un cop d'ull a l'augment dels extremismes, a les tendències antisistema de les noves generacions. Aquest matí llegia l'última enquesta de YouGov, que és de l'abril, una enquesta feta amb joves entre els 16 i els 26 anys, és a dir, gent realment jove, dels 16 als 26, generació Z. El 57% prefereix la democràcia com a forma de govern, bé, però és el 57, no és el 75, i no és igual a tots els països. A Polònia és el 48%, per tant, per sota del 50%, a Espanya és el 52%, per sobre, però no massa, i és cert que a països com a França o com a Alemanya les xifres són millors, 71%. Un 21% dels joves acceptarien en determinades condicions un govern autoritari, entre els quals el 23% dels joves a Espanya. I un 10% no donen importància a que el govern sigui democràtic o no. El 48% creuen que la democràcia està en perill en el seu país, 61% dels joves alemanys pensen que la democràcia està en perill en el seu país i un de cada 3 joves en situació de fragilitat econòmica no dona suport a la democràcia. Podria seguir amb altres dades, penso que aquestes són prou esclaridores del moment que vivim. I una quarta certesa, si voleu, i és que hem de ser capaços de reaccionar i que hem de reaccionar ara. Jo penso que tenim un període de temps, probablement entre els 3 i els 5 anys, en els quals la Unió Europea ha de ser capaç de donar resposta a tota una sèrie de reptes i de fer front a tota una sèrie de perills. I penso que ho està fent amb moltes dificultats, per descomptat, amb moltes limitacions, i tots sabem quines són les limitacions polítiques, les limitacions estructurals, amb moltes frustracions, frustració de la pròpia opinió pública, també de vegades dels mateixos dirigents polítics o d'aquells que volien anar més ràpid, però s'està fent. Hi ha una certa consciència que estem davant de, no sé si dir l'última oportunitat de construir una Europa adaptada als nous temps, és a dir, una Europa que sigui més autònoma del que és ara, una Europa que pugui parlar amb igualtat de condicions amb les grans potències d'aquest món, una Europa capaç de defensar l'estat de dret i de donar oportunitats a tothom, una Europa capaç de combinar el creixement econòmic amb l'obligació de frenar el canvi climàtic, estem veient tots els dies, amb l'incendi d'abans d'ahir, amb 2 víctimes mortals a pocs quilòmetres d'aquí, i una Europa solidària amb la resta del món, encara més ara quan països com els Estats Units, però no només els Estats Units, han decidit retallar les xifres de la seva cooperació al desenvolupament. I això ho hem de fer entre tots i ho hem de fer a tots els nivells. Per descomptat que ho han de fer les institucions europees, per descomptat que ho han de fer els governs dels estats membres, però també ho hem de fer governs com el de Catalunya, dins de les nostres possibilitats, que són moltes, de la mateixa manera que penso que ho ha de fer la societat civil. Ho han de fer els estudiants, ho han de fer els investigadors, ho han de fer les empreses, els sindicats, les entitats de tota mena. I nosaltres, sincerament, penso que ho estem fent, o que estem fent tot allò que pensem que podem fer. I posaré un parell d'exemples només d'aquesta setmana. Dilluns vam estar a Sevilla, com sabeu, fins ahir hi havia la Conferència de Nacions Unides sobre el finançament de les polítiques de desenvolupament. Vam anar a promoure el paper que han de jugar els governs regionals en aquesta cooperació al desenvolupament i com també governs com el de Catalunya poden ser importants a l'hora d'aconseguir aquests famosos objectius de desenvolupament sostenible d'aquí a l'any 2030. També farem el mateix a partir del diumenge amb un viatge al Marroc per observar què és el que està fent la cooperació catalana en aquest país, per parlar amb les seves autoritats, per veure com podem reforçar, diguem-ne, la coordinació entre 2 països, entre 2 territoris que tenen molt a aprendre l'un de l'altre. Ahir i abans d'ahir, a Brussel·les, intentant influenciar al màxim el debat i les futures decisions sobre el futur immediat de la Unió Europea. Estem parlant dels pressupostos multianals de la Unió Europea, del 2028 al 2035. Aquesta serà la gran batalla dels propers 2 anys. Aquesta serà la batalla a partir de la qual sabrem quin tipus de futur podem imaginar per la Unió Europea. Les polítiques de cohesió, la competitivitat, el concepte obert de seguretat, el paper de les regions, la defensa de les mesures contra el canvi climàtic, la promoció d'una nova política mediterrània adaptada als nous temps, tots aquests són temes que ara, en aquest moment, s'han de començar a decidir en el si de les institucions europees i aquí nosaltres també volem jugar el nostre paper. I acabo de citar la política mediterrània, crec que és un dels temes sobre els quals tractareu avui. Estem a poques setmanes, a pocs mesos, de celebrar el 30è aniversari del procés de Barcelona, que és el procés de llançament de la cooperació entre els països de la Unió Europea i la riba sud de la Mediterrània, Com sabeu, l'entitat, l'organisme internacional que se n'ocupa, la Unió per la Mediterrània, té la seva seu aquí a Barcelona, i aquest aniversari arriba en un moment important en el qual crec que conflueixen diversos factors al mateix temps. Primer, el fet que hem de fer front a nous reptes i desafiaments també en aquesta àrea de la política regional mediterrània, noves tensions geopolítiques, per no parlar de conflictes tan cruels com el que està passant a Gaza o el que va passar recentment al Líban o el que va passar durant molt de temps a Síria, desigualtats estructurals, crisi climàtica també per descomptat, la gestió dels fluxos migratoris, la pressió demogràfica. Al mateix temps, jo penso realment una mica més d'interès per part de les institucions europees, per part de la Comissió Europea, i això ho prova el fet que aquesta vegada tinguem una comissària que específicament es dedica a la política mediterrània, i la idea de llançar d'aquí a uns mesos un nou pacte per la Mediterrània, que ha de ser un pacte europeu i al mateix temps un pacte amb tots els països que formen part d'aquest procés de Barcelona. I en aquest marc, nosaltres, com a govern de Catalunya, farem les nostres pròpies propostes, les estem fent per intentar també influir en les proposicions que aprovarà la Comissió Europea, ho farem també d'aquí a unes setmanes aprovant l'estratègia mediterrània del propi govern de la Generalitat, el posicionament del govern de la Generalitat respecte a un tema que lògicament ens afecta molt directament. Buscant què? Doncs la cooperació entre iguals, superant aquesta idea de l'assistencialisme del nord cap al sud, promovent la governança multinivell, no només al nivell dels estats, també, lògicament, al nivell europeu, però al nivell subestatal, al nivell de les regions europees, al nivell dels poders locals, que en molts casos en el nord d'Àfrica i en altres parts de la Mediterrània tenen també un pes específic molt important, les grans ciutats mediterrànies. I buscant també una arquitectura de finançament adaptada a aquesta realitat a través del famós Global Gateway, que també ha de donar una oportunitat de participació directa a governs com el govern de Catalunya. Posar les persones al centre, impulsar la cohesió social, polítiques més eficients, igualtat de gènere, gestió migratòria justa, basada en els drets humans, suport a la transició verda, a l'economia circular, a la digitalització, prioritzar la joventut i les seves necessitats, especialment pel que fa a l'educació. Aquesta, d'alguna manera, hauria de ser la carta o hauria de ser el menú de les reivindicacions que nosaltres volem posar a sobre de la taula amb aquesta nova política de cooperació mediterrània. Bé, com deia abans, anem cap a un món diferent, per tant, és més important que mai saber qui som i què és el que volem. Ens hem de prendre probablement molt més seriosament nosaltres mateixos, haurem de ser capaços de teixir més acords, de teixir noves complicitats, primer entre nosaltres, els països de la Unió Europea, però també amb la resta del món. Som una petita part, però som una part important, no som més del 5, del 6% de la població del món, però continuem sent, en moltes coses positives, un referent positiu. I per tant haurem de ser capaços de crear, de teixir noves aliances, ara que semblen trontollar algunes de les nostres aliances històriques, amb altres regions del planeta, amb el sud-est asiàtic, amb Latinoamèrica, amb el nord d'Àfrica, però fent-ho amb humilitat i amb coherència. I quan dic amb coherència vull dir evitant els dobles estàndards, evitant que el que prediquem, per exemple, per Ucraïna, no ho estem predicant per Palestina. I sobretot defensant el nostre propi model, que és aquest model una mica lent de fer funcionar, és cert, una mica complicat, perquè són molts països alhora, basat en el que realment exigeix temps i paciència, el diàleg, l'acord, la discussió permanent, d'alguna manera, però que també és segurament el model més just entre els models possibles en aquest moment, el més humà davant de les autocràcies, davant de les oligocràcies o davant dels matonismes ramplons que semblen imposar-se en alguns llocs d'aquest planeta. I segur que les reflexions que compartireu avui aquí, el vostre interès i les vostres preocupacions ens ajudaran entre tots a trobar aquest bon camí. Moltes gràcies i molt bona feina.
This was loud. Back again, thank you for staying with us also in this part of the roundtable, also for the roundtable after the dialogue with the MEP Lucia Annunziata. We're gonna speak again, continue speaking on cooperation and conflict in the EU's southern neighbor and the new Mediterranean agenda. I'm going to introduce you to my speakers, our speakers. On my right-hand side, I start from the man, okay? Well, anyway, Samuele Abrami, research fellow of Barcelona Centre for International Affairs. I started with him because he's going to be the first one to speak. Then I have Kasia Sidło. I pronounce it correctly because Polish is not, I studied it, I told it, but I don't remember that much. Senior analyst of European Union and International Security Studies. Yes, I did it. And on my right-hand side, we have Maria Cristina Urbano, European Commission. But I'm starting from Samuele. They're going to speak about the Mediterranean agenda, the new approach of the EU to Mediterranean southern and eastern neighbors, a topic which we discussed before with Annunziata. And we go more into the details of this topic. I'll start with Samuele because he's going to give us an overview of the EU foreign and security policy in the southern neighborhood and the current challenges and possible improvements for a more unified and coherent approach. Please, Samuele, we have a discussion of 1 hour and half an hour of Q&A, just like before. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much, Angela, for the introduction. Honor for me to speak here today. Of course, it's not easy to give an overview about something that is changing so fast, so quickly, in a very unpredictable way. So we can't really foresee how any actor will and can position in this ever-changing scenario. But I would actually try to recall something that I think relates to the place where we are now, and also to, let's say, my personal story, in the sense that I was born in 1995, and we are in Barcelona. So I think this calls actually to the anniversary of the Barcelona process, and when I was preparing for this speech, I was trying to assess at which point are we now thinking back at that time when the Barcelona process was conceived. What's the difference? What's the difference in the spirit of the people who basically outlined that declaration, and the spirit of policymakers today in Europe, but even in countries that cooperate or at least try to face the challenges together or against Europe today. So basically, I found actually a quote by an author that was saying that paradoxically, the Barcelona process was brought about by a non-Mediterranean event, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, whether this is true or not, of course, this tells us the fact that the context was quite different, because the context after the end of the Cold War was quite promising. People, policymakers at different levels, I would say, of the polity of Europe were actually thinking about a positive scenario in which institution, the then European Union, could actually leverage on so-called soft power instruments, economic tools, trade agreements, something that could even go beyond the European Union membership per se, and try to integrate and cooperate with countries beyond the European Union, in which a region like the southern neighborhood, the countries in the so-called southern neighborhood, has always represented both a challenges but also an opportunity for the EU to expand its own interests, but also to stabilize the geopolitical context that basically has no real borders right in the Mediterranean area. And what is different today? Today, the main difference is that we're talking about uncertain polarity. We don't know which country stays with whom, who's making alliances with whom, why, in which way, for how long is it going to last. Also global norms, those norms on which things like the Barcelona process were built on, nowadays they do not seem to hold anymore today, because even actors within the European Union are contesting these norms, and this also undermines the credibility of the European Union and its member states towards the region, because the European Union was actually acting as a normative actor back then. Today we are talking about a geopolitical turn of the European Union, but those countries in the southern neighborhood who are not part of European Union sometimes seem to have difficulties in understanding what this geopolitical turn mean for the region, for them, or even for how the EU conceives itself as a geopolitical actor. What actually remains similar, I think, is some sort of an opportunity for the EU, despite not being just or anymore normative actor, or at least being a normative actor also with a more geopolitical stance, is the fact that in any way and anyhow the European Union has to cooperate with countries in the south, because even, I mean, now we are even talking about a more globalized world than what we were talking about 30 years ago. So everything is so interconnected in a way that we cannot disconnect Europe and its actors from the world. And I'm talking about migration, I'm also talking about energy security, and also a way that if the European Union wants to have some sort of leverage, even geopolitically, sometimes it has to rely on actors that are not fully part of members of the European Union. And of course, the European Union has made steps throughout the years, and it has elaborated a neighborhood policy. But for example, a thing like 2011 Arab uprising, where they caught European Union a bit unprepared, in the sense that it was meant to be a watershed. It could have been an opportunity for the EU to promote democracy in the region. We were actually thinking about Tunisia as one of the successful examples of democracy promotion. But then if we look at reality nowadays, more than a decade after, we are actually seeing that even though some governments, some autocratic regimes have gone, they have fallen, they were not replaced by full democracy. They were actually replaced by other types of regimes, and the European Union basically had to somehow find a way, a modus vivendi, you know, some would say, with these regimes. And that meant actually operating in a way that is close to what was already raised before in the discussion, which is externalization of migration, securitization, and weaponization by other actors of all the issues that are perceived as threats by the European Union. We have, for example, the migration deal with Turkey, and what was promised was not actually then given to Turkey. This has, for example, alienated a country that has been for a long time waiting at the doors of Europe. Then we've also seen democratic backsliding in that country. The same discourse goes, for example, with Lebanon. Now we have agreements with Albania. And these, in my view, actually portrays European Union in the region as the so-called fortress Europe, a Europe that doesn't really want to cooperate in a full-fledged way, but is more like transactional in its way of operating. So the normative and the conditionalities that were there back then seem to work in a different way, or the conditionalities seem to be based on a more short-term way of interacting between these actors. And in terms of foreign policy, of course, I was also reading one of your reports of some time ago, and you also had a panel recently, I guess it was with ISPI probably, and you made a very good point about the fact that what blocks the European Union in taking fast, quick decision in reacting is the way in which the European Union functioned. Back then, that was actually a guarantee in terms of being able to make long-term sustainable deals. But nowadays, the difficulty is actually to reform European Union system and complex mechanism in the way that European Union can actually cope with crises that are erupting almost every day, and a scenario that is very difficult to cope with, not mentioning the war in Ukraine, but also wars like Gaza, and the expansion of the war throughout the Middle East lately. And here I think it's where probably we have the critical points. I don't want to delve into the issues that I'm talking about now, but just to mention what, for example, Gaza represents. For the war in Gaza I'm referring, but it's all, of course also the spillover effects of the war in Gaza. I think it's kind of a litmus test for the credibility of the European Union, and it's basically highlighting this tension between interest and values. But at this point, I think it's also not even clear what are the interests of the European Union, because we have internal divisions about how to act against the actions, for example, that Israel is also perpetrating now in the region. And of course, there would be some instruments or some leverage by the side of the European Union, but it seems that even the role of diplomacy, of mediation, has been overtaken by other actors. Even yesterday, we were talking about mediations by Egypt, by Qatar, whereas the European Union, at least in what has always represented and characterized its global role as a sui generis power, if we want to frame it like that. Even when we mentioned the latest 12 days war between Iran and Israel, it seems that these highlights also the transatlantic rift that we have now, because it seems there are allegations about the fact that the United States basically didn't talk to Europe before taking real action into the thing. And this is actually quite telling about the fact that European Union seems to be a stand-buyer in this situation. And if we're talking about strategic autonomy, an actor that is supposed to become or evolve into a geopolitical actor, how come you have no leverage in a situation in which, I mean, there's a potential spillover, an increase of potential spillover throughout the region that in the end would affect much more directly European borders rather than the United States in this sense. And then, of course, we have a scenario like Syria that has represented one of the most critical points of the European Union policy in the southern neighborhood lately in terms of migration, securitization, and I think it's there probably where the European Union actually has made some steps lately and where we can see which are the tools that the European Union can use, because the European Union, I think, has no competitors in its capability in about operating in post-conflict scenarios, in post-conflict management, in post-conflict reconstruction through investments, capabilities, know-how, forces of different kind, engagement of civil societies, NGO, and so on. And so just to conclude, I would also refer to one of the articles that was co-authored also by our president here at CIDOB, Joseph Borrell, in Foreign Affairs, and he said that Europe must stop lingering at the margins and use full panoply of legal, financial, and political tools at its disposal. So there is a belief, actually, even within institutions in the European Union, of people that have been part of institutions in the European Union, that the European Union has the tools. It is just about making steps, in my view, on three main points. One is basically to to reframe a little bit the decision-making process. So this means tackling the issue of qualified majority on certain issues, because we know that the common and security foreign policy of the European Union is mostly based on a different kind of majority voting. Strategic autonomy shouldn't be just a buzzword that we make use in a crisis mood of reacting to the situation nowadays, but should actually mean that the European Union stops somehow assuming that the US would lead everything that happens in the southern neighborhood of the European Union. So European Union should act independently somehow to what are the interests, and we don't even know nowadays what are the interests and the plans for the Middle East in the US, in the White House nowadays, right? And this means, for example, elaborating clearer strategic partnerships with the Gulf, for example. European Union could have more direct talk with Gulf countries without passing always through the United States in that case. Engaging countries that are controversial like Turkey, but if we face reality, countries like Turkey represent strategic partners in terms of migration, but also in terms of achieving strategic autonomy beyond European Union membership, like in the case of making deals with the UK or Canada, whatever, or Norway. And then, I repeat myself, engaging with civil society at, let's say, a bottom-up level in which I think the European Union has no equals. So I would actually probably conclude here my speech, and thinking about what was the Barcelona process spirit, I think nowadays we can actually have some hope about the European Union making a strategic turn that doesn't really go away from the values that are at the core basis of the European Union, because otherwise we would alienate even more those actors that back then were seeing the European Union as an opportunity even to improve in their domestic context. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuele. For my brief follow-up question, I would ask you, you've been describing very, very carefully all the challenges that the European Union has nowadays. For those challenges, as you were saying, Europe is not so ready. My question is, isn't it too late, as now we have all these emergencies, but we also have stronger and stronger nationalist parties who are strong in the polls or are governing most of the member states of the European Union, and we know that they don't imagine to reform Europe, to build a stronger Europe. They want a Europe of nations, and so they still have to explain to us how they imagine to cope in this way with all the challenges we have, but this is the thing. I mean, people still vote for them. So don't you think it's maybe too late, or how could Europe solve the problem could gain again the attention of European citizens, which are maybe a bit frustrated?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's very interesting, especially being Italian. I think I can refer to the fact, if there's a positive thing about this crisis mood, is the fact that it affects the way in which politicians like Meloni, they shiftily and quickly change their mindset or their position when they have to cope with such situations. Because if we think about what the party of Giorgia Meloni, her coalition were actually proposing some years ago, is totally different from what they are talking about today. So it means that if there's a will, there's a way in the end. Even in Germany, it doesn't really seem, we don't really see a huge discrepancy and difference between the two governments' stance. We have a different rhetoric. We might have a different discourse. But what I feel is that if all governments, regardless of their political affiliation, they really face the reality, in the end, there's a way to cooperate. Even a taboo, talking about weapons in Italy, talking about war in Italy is some sort of a taboo, almost like as it is here in Spain, I would say. But if in the end, if we look at reality, the Meloni government made deals, and important deals, for example, between Baikar and Leonardo, basically tells us that a country that is not part of the European Union, like Turkey, has made a deal with one of the best defense player and production companies of armaments in Europe. So this basically also goes to what we were discussing before, the way you present and justify it to the people. You should give the impression that you create a humus, a scenario, a context in which you create consensus, and you just not take decision for the sake of staying in power or having political leverage to spend later, I feel.
I agree. Thanks, Samuele. Maria Cristina, Policy Officer at the European Commission, she will guide us into this new object of the new mandate, the new Pact for the Mediterranean, and she will tell us what it is. She will give us an overview and the recent milestones, when it will be launched, what does it mean?
Grazie mille Angela, buon dia a tutti. Muchas gracias a la oficina del Parlamento Europeo Barcelona, la Comisión Europea y al CIDOB. I will continue in English. So thanks again. So my name is Maria Cristina. I work as policy officer in the DG MENA, which was mentioned by Angela earlier this morning is the new DG that has been established as of February 2025. And it's, I think by itself, its establishment, it's a witness to the fact that the Mediterranean has a per se importance for the new College of the Commissioners. The DG MENA, so DG for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf, has now taken full responsibilities for the Southern Neighbourhood region, for the Gulf, after the reorganization of DG NEAR, and is meant to be the entry point for the Commission for all the countries in these three different regions. And as Angela just mentioned, indeed, under the political leadership of our Commissioner for the Mediterranean, Dubravka Šuica, and also in close collaboration with the High Representative and Vice President Kaja Kallas, our mandate, our main purpose for this mandate of the Commission is indeed to work on a new pact for the Mediterranean. Of course, the new pact is not happening in a vacuum. We have all been talking about the challenges and the opportunities that actually are present in the region. Already this morning, Samuela has perfectly set the scene and I think has given an overview of the complexity of the region. But indeed, as Luciano Annunziata was saying this morning, geography is a fact. The Mediterranean is our neighborhood, and of course, ever since the start of the neighborhood policy, it has been a priority for the EU, and this will continue to be also in this mandate. So indeed, for us, the Union for the Mediterranean was mentioned. I mean, Barcelona is the home of the Union for the Mediterranean, but of course from the EU perspective, the main policy framework for relations with the 10 countries in the southern neighborhood is the EU neighborhood policy, and most recently the new agenda for the Mediterranean that was published in 2021. So, sorry, I was a bit long, but it was just to make sure that we have the scene set and we can now come to what's next, indeed, the new pact for the Mediterranean. And again, it's not happening in a vacuum, both in a chronological sense, but also in terms of like what exists already. The pact is going to complement what is there, both at bilateral level and at regional level, and is going to be presented in the third quarter of the year, so ideally this autumn, after the summer, and will aim at narrowing down some concrete innovative initiatives that are based on agreement between, of course, the European Union, the member states, and... Better? Fantastic, okay. Apologies for that. I'm available in case something was not clear earlier to clarify eventually. But indeed, innovative initiatives that are narrowed down also on the most consensual way possible. And it is for this reason that we have been involved in extensive consultation to make sure that the pact has as a basis a wide consensus and participation from, of course, member states, partner countries, and various stakeholders. So I just wanted to give a couple of words of how these consultations have taken place. So first and foremost, of course, at the political level, Commissioner Šuica has been traveling throughout the region, has been in contact with the member states. Our Director General, Stefano Sannino, also has visited the region, has met local and national authorities, NGOs, civil society organizations. So this is probably a first brick of our engagement with the region to make sure that their perspective is taken into account. Secondly, we have been working very closely with the Institute for the Mediterranean, which is also has its seat here in Barcelona. And we have been working on a survey that has been opened to the public over the course of March. And we have just received the results of this survey. And I think the main takeaway of this public consultation that has gathered basically input from both shores of the Mediterranean, and maybe we also have somebody here who has participated themselves, is that besides some of the criticism that have been raised, the European Union is still seen as a stable partner for the region. So it is in this light that we will continue working with the partners in the region at all levels. And then, of course, also thanks to the support of the Institute for the Mediterranean, we have been organizing a number of meetings and consultation events, both in Brussels and in the region. These have been kick-started, the consultation circles, they started in Brussels in the beginning of April. Then we had 2 regional events, both in Rabat and in Cairo. And we had a closing the circle event, so a final moment to gather input and discuss in Brussels on the 12th of June. And this was really the occasion for us to gather the ideas of academia, experts, civil society, non-governmental organization, and to make sure that we can also take into consideration the proposals that are given by, indeed, not only institutional stakeholders. This event has taken place back-to-back with a meeting with senior representatives of the member states and of partners. So there are, as you can see, there are different bricks, there are different elements of these consultations. We are now in the process of elaborating them, and over the course of the summer, we will start with the drafting of the pact. Of course, something like a bit of a preview of what it could be, what has emerged from this consultation is that there will be 3 pre-identified macro areas of cooperation where we will eventually narrow down such concrete initiatives, which are first, human development, second, economics and investments, and third, work related to peace, stability and resilience in the region. So now, on the basis of these elements, of these macro elements, but also the more detailed input that we have received, we will proceed also in-house to elaborate the different initiatives. So just to summarize, what I would like to pass are 3 main points. So first, that the idea with the pact is really to narrow down specific initiatives, concrete, that can bring tangible results for societies in the 2 shores of the Mediterranean. Secondly, that the pact indeed does not happen in a vacuum. It will be complementary with what is taking place at bilateral, at regional level. And finally, we said that the pact will be adopted in autumn, but this is not the end of the process. And this is something that needs to be very clear. The idea of maintaining the dialogue, of maintaining the exchanges that we have had with the partner countries, with the member states, with civil society organizations, will continue also after the adoption of the pact, both to look at the implementation of the pact, but on the other hand also to see what kind of adjustments can be needed over the course of the years. Because indeed, as colleagues have already mentioned before, it is a region that is quite volatile. So we will need to adapt over the course of the years depending on the needs of the partner countries. And indeed, this is going to be an initiative based on mutual interest. So maintaining the dialogue aspect will be very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. I would ask you, I mean, I noticed this morning also in the session, for those of you who were present, there were a lot of questions on this new European approach to southern neighborhood linked to a new approach also on migration and asylum, and the decision to externalize the management of these issues, which are strategic to us. What can you tell us in this respect? Don't you see, how do you reply to the, I've read some criticism on the new pact already, even though it hasn't been launched yet. Some observers say that it risks to be another Brussels-centered initiative and not a genuine project for the co-creation of a project with southern and eastern neighborhood. Are you, in the Commission where you work, in the DG MENA, are you aware of this risk and how are you coping with it? Thanks.
Thank you, Angela. Of course, we are aware of the criticism, but I think so far the Commission, together with the EIS, has been doing quite a good job in ensuring that this project is, to the extent possible, consensual and co-owned with the partner countries. I mentioned already how the consultation have been carried out. I think I can add maybe a little bit more on this, saying that the Institute for the Mediterranean, for us, has mentioned that the survey that they have carried out has been the one with the highest number of participants in the past years, and this already gives an idea of how much this topic is of importance on both sides of the Mediterranean, but also gives you a bit of a flavor of how many experts, how many even citizens have had the chance to give their say about the Pact for the Mediterranean. And then I can give you also a little bit of an overview. This consultations event that took place in the region, they were attended by over 80 people, representing civil society organization, academia, universities, private sector. So I think, of course, I think, as in all things, there is a margin of making things better, but I think we have been doing a pretty good job, and the idea to maintain this dialogue, this exchange with these stakeholders will further reinforce the idea that this project is really co-owned by society across the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Our last panelist, I introduced her already to you, Kasia Sidwo, will discuss with us, she will talk of the new pact for the Mediterranean as well, but focusing in particular on the role of the Gulf countries in the broader Mediterranean European approach. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angela. Yes, that's definitely one of the things I wanted to bring to the table, because Maria Cristina already introduced the technicalities of the pact very well. So first I wanted to zoom out a little bit, maybe to understand why we give so much attention to this new pact. In a way, this really shows the European Union thinking about its neighborhood, for good and for bad. So I don't know to what extent you're aware about different previous European Union frameworks, political frameworks when it comes to the engagement with the southern neighborhood. Of course, Samuela mentioned the Barcelona Declaration. So there's a long string of thinking about how to best engage with the southern neighborhood countries of the EU. Before the pact, we had the new agenda for the Mediterranean, the previous efforts that followed up after the revision of the European Neighbourhood policy. So all that shows you that the EU is really thinking very hard. What are the best ways to cooperate with the southern neighbourhood, how to improve the things that didn't work before. And I would have to say that really the big improvement when it comes to the pact is the extent of those consultations. This was a big criticism of the agenda, which, well, I extended myself, that the agenda was indeed what the name suggests, agenda, something that was slightly more imposed, and the pact is supposed to be indeed more encompassing the opinions of the partners in the southern neighborhood. Someone during the previous session asked about Sahel. Sahel is outside of the what's considered within the US southern neighborhood, but it's neighbor of the neighbor. So in that way, Sahel is also incorporated into bigger thinking. And for all I know, the Commission has been also talking to partners in Sahel about the new pact. So this is not completely forgotten, the Sahel. And within the broader neighbors of the neighbors, we also have the Gulf cooperation countries. Now, previously, the Gulf was treated separately from the southern neighborhood for multiple reasons. Right now, DG MENA, the newly created DG MENA, is dealing with the Gulf countries as well. And while the new pact is separate framework for the countries in the southern neighborhood and the cooperation with the Gulf cooperation countries are held under the strategic partnership with the Gulf, which is a document, strategic document that will lead the cooperation of the EU with the Gulf, and then we'll have the individual cooperation agreements, hopefully with individual countries. So there's also this kind of two-way approach that will be applied under the pact. So first we talk to individual partner countries, but we also want to have a more broad regional vision. Now, the will to cooperate more closely with the Gulf stems also from the realization that we can't achieve as much alone in the neighborhood as we can with other players in the neighborhood. And that goes somehow against what's going on globally right now. So the shift away from multilateralism, a shift away from the global cooperations. And here the thinking of the EU goes that the countries in the Gulf, for better or for worse, have very strong interests in the countries in our southern neighborhood as well. And there's a lot of scope for cooperation, again, for better or for worse, when it comes to stabilizing Syria, incorporating reforms and rebuilding Syria, processing with peace in Gaza, but also in terms of the economic development more broadly. In general, this new thinking that comes with the pact, with closer engagement with the Gulf, is of course playing into something that was touched upon later in the morning, and I believe during the past days. So reconsideration to what extent we're still closely following this kind of Europe as the normative factor, and to what extent we want to focus more on strategic interests and the balance between the two. Again, this is a result of certain failures of the previous engagement in the EU in the region, with being placed in almost an impossible situation, where on the one hand you're being accused as the EU of trying to impose certain standards and values, and on the other hand being accused of not really promoting the certain values at the same time. So this is a very difficult position which the EU has to navigate, and to a large extent it boils down to the fact that we're dealing with both expectations of the populations in the region and the governments in the region. And their interests are not always the same. Most of the time they might not be the same. And that's a difficulty with the pact as well. Because on the one hand, you want to negotiate the agreement with the countries, because it's the governments you cooperate with on individual things, like changes in, well, starting from the trade agreements, which are going nowhere right now, and I can talk about this a little bit more later, through any kind of migration agreements, through visa liberalization, through cooperation on education, student exchange, and multitude of different things that can only be negotiated with the governments. But at the same time as the EU, you want to talk to the civil society, you want to talk to the academia, you want to talk to the researcher, to the business people, and incorporate their perspective as well. And in that, I think this dual approach of having the pact as having two pillars, one, having agreements with individual countries, and then having an umbrella for the region, can help to solve this dilemma in a way that this regional umbrella can a little bit more incorporate those bottom-up initiatives in a way that agreements with individual countries perhaps cannot do. Two more things I wanted to mention when it comes to this kind of broader, because it is the dilemma for the EU, how to really cooperate closely with the neighborhood, with both, yes, thinking about our interests and being, I guess, more assertive about it, not because of the geopolitical environment, but also because of lessons learned from the past, so being more open about what is important for us. But at the same time, listening and trying to find common ground of what is important for the partners. And those two things I wanted to talk about are stemming from my kind of thoughts from the previous interventions and from the discussion in the morning. And one is about what Ms. Annunziata said about when she was discussing Ukraine, and there was a question how this relates to, to what's going on in the South. We're supposed to talk about the South. And I want to stress that those two theaters are very critically connected. And I think to a large extent, a lot of failures so far in our foreign policy and the way that the EU is functioning is this kind of silo thinking, with some member states focusing solely on what's their national interest in terms of immediate interest, and not really seeing the bigger picture. And I'm not talking only about how the common threat in all those neighborhoods is Russia, because Russia is a threat not just in Ukraine, let's be clear. It's a big threat in multiple countries in the southern neighborhood. From Libya, where it's visible more and more clearly and more strongly. Through Syria, where it's still present, and it's still trying to do its job underneath, despite the fall of the Assad regime. Through many other instances where Russia is more or less visibly, not just through disinformation that we know about. I will give you one small example on that, just to show you how the ways that Russia is working in the southern neighborhood. You've all heard about outright disinformation through, I suppose you all heard through Russia RT and official Russian channels that are having their outlets in Arabic. But Russian outlets have also been signing content sharing agreements with local media in the Arab countries. So a lot of information that is being posted by the Arab media in Morocco, in Algeria, throughout the entire region is direct content sharing from Russian outlets without this being said explicitly. So this is arguably a more dangerous way of spreading Russia's disinformation and misinformation. So that's one important factor why the two theaters are connected. It's also because Russia's presence in southern neighborhood, but also in Sahel and more broadly in sub-Saharan Africa, is directly funding the effort of Russia in Ukraine. So for the EU, this is very important. And this is more perhaps important for the Eastern countries and Central European member states to really appreciate and get more involved in shaping of the future policy in the southern neighborhood. In the past, while Assad regime was still in place, what Russia has been doing was using the air bases in Syria to fly gold from Sudan through Syria back to Russia to finance their efforts to fight in Ukraine. And there are many different connections, going around sanctions through using shadow fleet in the Mediterranean and using a regime in Libya to help with those efforts. So a lot of connection points that perhaps are not immediately visible, but really should be understood more broadly, and I think are slowly understood more broadly, in a sense that you can't really separate fully the two theaters. I think it's good we have separate the Gemina, because the frameworks, the political outlook is completely different from countries that are aspiring to joining the EU from those that are not. But in general, I think it's important, this is one of the key messages I wanted to forward, is that really thinking about cooperation and conflict in the southern neighborhood cannot be done in separation from thinking about EU positioning within the broader neighborhood in general. And that brings me to my second point, which is thinking about, and this again stems from one of the comments that was made. I don't want to point to anyone individual, but that's something I hear in general a lot, but that reminded me of this. Just thinking about threats coming from the south. If we continue in this mindset of thinking about southern neighborhood and Africa as a threat, then we're not going to progress with our policy no matter how many consultations we carry out. Yes, there are threats coming from the south. There are threats coming from the east. But in general, thinking more about what threats we are facing in common is kind of a better way of moving the policy forward. And finally, on something that Samuel pointed out that I mentioned before in one of my interventions, one of the panels, about the tools that the EU has. Yes, our foreign policy is complicated because of the member states' interest, because the way that the voting is being done within the EU, of the qualified majority versus unanimity. And this is blocking us to a large extent. And I will close with this, that I spoke before this, there's some silver lining to that. And bigger thinking about how to turn this problem of taking a long time to process certain decisions and finding common ground and consensus within what different member states want within different certain policy areas. And is that, there has to be middle ground in between doing foreign policy through months and months of consultations about individual words and between just posting 20 different tweets a day in all caps, right? So going into direction of discussing more broadly how our foreign policy wants to be shaped is also part of thinking about how we want to shape our foreign policy in our immediate neighborhood as well. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Kasia. I would ask you, maybe, yeah, we have time, about the risk of over-dependence on this, you know, the Gulf countries and these non-EU actors, given also their authoritarian drift. Can this be a risk for union which is based on other kind of values?
Absolutely. This is something we have in mind. But at the same time, if you want to cooperate on very concrete set of goals, I think it's still very much possible. So again, there are common interests in terms of rebuilding Syria, in terms of stabilizing the neighborhood. And when you think about efforts like electrification, which is like the basic thing that we need to do in Syria for the country to even start, you know, processing with the renovation, this is not very heavy political, right? It doesn't really matter that much. So there's a number of things that we are looking into cooperation with the Gulf. When you look at the strategic partnership agreement, energy is of course one of the important interests, common interests. There's the AI that both the EU and the GCC are thinking very strategically about. There's people to people, and this is important, being closer in terms of building bottom-up exchanges, common cooperation on Horizon, on Erasmus, you know, just building connections between people to understand each other better and to form this closer cooperation. I know in the PAC there's this ambition to create the Union of Mediterranean Universities. Perhaps the Gulf universities could be at some point incorporated into that as well. So there's a multitude of things that we can work on together, even though, yes, there are authoritarian tendencies, but we work with a multitude of different countries that have different internal policies, and we have to do it. That's diplomacy. And also individual countries have different levels, different ambitions of you know, processing internal change in political terms. And I think the idea of closer cooperation is that without trying to impose any kind of change, when you work closely on certain things, and especially bottom up with the society, perhaps the change can come with time from within.
Thank you. And now I can open the Q&A session, so it's your turn. You can ask questions to our three panelists. Okay.
Buenos días. Gracias por la intervención, las aportaciones. Y me preocupa una interrogante que viene, diríamos, como consecuencia de lo siguiente. En las exposiciones que ha habido ahora y en la anterior, estamos hablando de la cooperación con el sur de Europa. Pero en estas aportaciones no he visto en ningún momento un planteamiento de qué es lo que espera el sur de Europa de nosotros. Primer punto. Si a este punto le añado el hecho de que lo que está ocurriendo en Gaza y la Comunidad Económica Europea guarda silencio ante la postura de la presidencia de Estados Unidos, si vemos lo que ha pasado en Siria, lo que está pasando en Libia, lo que ha pasado con la marcha de Francia del Sahel, del Níger y del Chad, el tema de las tierras raras y de los nuevos minerales necesarios para el crecimiento digital y de la industria occidental, me pregunto cómo nos ven los países del sur de Europa a nosotros, teniendo en cuenta que además está progresando en Europa la extrema derecha y la derecha. Y entonces mi pregunta concreta sería, ¿nos ven como una Europa que intenta establecer de nuevo un neocolonialismo?
Or or how do they see us?
Okay, you want to indicate which panelist you were referring to? Whoever, okay. So who?
Do you want to pick some other questions? Angela,
Okay,
you want to pick?
we can, yeah, we can collect a few questions and then we answer.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. Katrina, it's very interesting what you said about the silos and how both conflicts are connected, and I think this resounds very well here in Spain. But I'm wondering whether we are capable of looking beyond Russia as a threat, and I'm referring to the States, basically. Because the United States has been disordering the region for a very long time, much worse than Russia has. And I'm wondering whether in Europe we are seeing this and we are doing something about this. And this is not only a question for you, but also for the Commission, if you are aware that this is that the US is also a potential threat in the region. And Samuela, well, you, of course.
Okay, are there other questions? Sure there are, yes.
I'm also happy to step in the discussion on Russia, which I found extremely stimulating as well. On the basis of joint threat perception, right? This is what I want. Of course, threat perception is always context dependent, right? It depends on where you stand geographically. It depends on the sources of instability that you receive from external actors, Russia being a clear case in point. But I wanted to inquire you, Katrina, about how to, you said, we need to frame cooperation with the South through the possibility of engagement, cooperation, mutual benefits, which is, by the way, Samuela reminded us on Maria Cristina as well, the logic of Barcelona process and every subsequent step to that, right? But at the same time, you said, but Russia is a threat in the region, right? So we need to be aware of that threat. My question is, how do you convince member states of the European Union that perceive Russia as a distant threat, but instability in the South as a very, if not imminent, very next to come threat when it comes to migration, when it comes to illegal flows, when it comes to drug trafficking, when it comes from other sources of instability that are not direct invasion of a country, I mean.
Maybe we can start answering. It's 3 questions. What do you think? Yeah. Okay, who wants to take the floor for the first one, which was not addressing one particular panelist?
I can take the first one, which is probably the trickiest one, because when we're talking about a neo-colonial approach in terms of foreign policy, it's not easy to give an answer, because there's, I feel, a disconnection between how an actor like the EU conceives itself, and sometimes genuinely conceiving its actions as not being colonialist, of being just a matter of foreign policy, of addressing certain specific issues. For example, we are talking about energy. European Union territory is not rich of energy. Where do you get energy from? Well, not from the European territory. So for that simple question is, you have to go in different territories, operate through different stakeholders that might be European, and need to cooperate with local partners, where probably the issue comes, because it's usually not a peer-to-peer cooperation, the one that we see in contexts like energy or rare materials nowadays, or things like that. But I feel that, for example, here, it's also a matter of narrative and discourses, because if we look at the context of Africa and Sahel, for example, Beijing, China, was able to build a different narrative, the so-called Beijing consensus, which was built on the assumption that it was different from the neo-colonialist approach of Washington and the West in general. And then we have We had actors like Russia that were actually intervening more silently to non-state actors which were indeed, in the end, funded by, directly by the Russian state, but also minor actors, like, for example, Turkey, operating through the so-called Ankara consensus, which is built on the narrative that, for example, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire then, were never colonial powers. Well, it's not really true, but the way in which you build some consensus in the leadership of Africa is also a long process. Because, for example, when we look at humanitarian aid, we see many countries from the Gulf, Turkey itself, being sometimes, on average, more active than the European Union as a whole in certain specific contexts, like, for example, the famine in Somalia and so on, but also in the way you address the leadership. Because, for example, many of the current leaders in Africa were intellectually raised, no longer in Europe, as it was the case, for example, right after the independence revolution in the 60s and in the 70s in Africa, but were actually intellectually raised in different contexts of the so-called global south, which is a bit less south than the so-called global south, like in Turkey, the UAE, and the Gulf. And those places that stand somehow in between geographically, they have a step in Europe somehow, they have the capabilities, they have the money, they have the know-how to raise a new generation of leadership. They basically shape a different mindset that when then is taken back to a complex context like the African one, stands somehow in a more balanced way than the so-called European intellectual mindset back then. So, of course, it's a matter of how you operate concretely through which instruments, but also how you cooperate at a people-to-people connection, and that takes more time, of course, than just seeking energy or whatever it is.
Thank you, Samuele.
Right. I will start with a tricky question about Russia. I do realize that coming here as a Polish person and talking about Russia, I risk contradicting what I said about just not pushing national agendas. But hear me out. I think there are two ways of thinking about this, and it's not just about convincing the member states that care more or feel a more immediate threat from migration, that Russia is a threat. It's also the other way around, to convincing the member states. Basically, it boils down to the European unity and really to what was built on. If your neighbor is safe, you are safe. If other member states are safe, we are collectively safe. So it's also about this feeling about what the EU really stands for. But on a more practical level, showing to the member states from the south how Russia is a threat can be very practically done with very practical examples. With migration, for instance, we know how Russia has previously already used migration as a weapon. How on the Polish-Belarusian border it created a threat, among other things, directly flying people from Iraq to Belarus and pushing them through Polish border. This is just one example. There's a lot of conversation we've been having about possibility, and this is not happening yet to my knowledge, but possibility of how Russia can weaponize migration in Algeria, in Libya, destabilizing Sahel countries to create directly and indirectly weaponize migration, but also by destabilizing Sahel and countries like Libya and continuing to try to destabilize further Syria, creating this migration pressure. So this is one thing. Second thing is not connected directly to migration, but there are things like electricity cuts, jamming GPS, election interference. This is not just happening in Eastern and Central Europe, this is happening throughout entire Europe. Russia is working in many different ways to destabilize Europe because of how it perceives the world, how it wants to both establish itself as a strong geopolitical actor, and the way to do it for Russia is to destabilize others. And because EU also is so closely seen as in one team with the US as the West, whether this is still true or not is a different question, and I will move to that. The EU will be a target. And this is also Russia's strategic way of thinking, to divide the EU by pointing out that more explicitly targeting Eastern European states to create divisions within the EU. This is also Russia's strategy. So we really need to work around that, both through thinking about it in a normative terms, how the EU's unity is important, but also through those very practical examples. Now on the US, this is more difficult because there is very big shift in thinking in the EU about US and our cooperation with the US. And this, of course, we've been talking in the morning about this new strategy, about how we started to understand we can only truly rely on ourselves, and not just in terms of defense, but more broadly. And I think with the southern neighborhood or the broader MENA region, it's true that the US has been a very destabilizing factor for a very long time, in different ways than Russia, but yes. And to me, for a very long time, we've been too closely following the US policy on many files in the MENA region. And this is perhaps also a wake-up call for us as the EU to understand we need to decouple our foreign policy from US foreign policy in the region, both by building different alliances. Here, talking with the Gulf countries has a lot of advantages also because they have the ear of the American administration more than we do right now. And we share many common interests with the Gulf countries when it comes to trying to persuade the US administration on many different files. But more broadly, stressing this multilateralism, but also stressing that the EU has its own foreign policy and is going to go with it.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please. Yeah, sorry, Maria Cristina. Sorry, I apologize.
No problem at all. I mean, much has already been said, just a couple of words. I've heard a lot referring about threats for Europe, for the European Union, but I think something that is not often looked up is that the same threats that we are facing are the same threats that the partner countries are facing. Some threats are not territorial. They are cross-cutting regions. They overcome seas. They overcome spatial territories. It's related to connectivity. Katarzyna was mentioning electricity. So it's really, I think we need to open up also to the fact that we share with partner countries, with neighbors, a lot of the same challenges. And for these same challenges, we need a common response. And this is also the reason why we are trying to look with them through the pact at specific initiatives that can actually tackle these challenges. But we have spoken a lot about threats, but we haven't spoken as much about opportunities. And I think this is also something that our narrative would need to focus much more on. And for instance, we have mentioned much migration. Migration as a threat, but migration is also a great opportunity for both sides of the Mediterranean. If you think about the majority of the people that come to Europe actually come legally through Blue Card Directive, through legal residence permit. I mean, they work in our university, they work in our market, and our markets still need a lot of people to fill the gaps in the current market. If you think about it, the European Commission has put forward a proposal for EU talent pool that will try to fill this gap, making a link with the partner countries. The European Commission has also been working on talent partnerships that are going to help boost legal migration from now a number of pilot countries, we have 5 now at the moment, towards the EU. And this also helps countering irregular migration. So I think we also need to look at this in this perspective, also in the sense that most of the migration that comes to Europe legally then happens in a circular way. So then people go back to their own countries, they benefit their own economies, their own societies, they build up their own business, they increase the resilience of their society. So I think I wanted to add this additional layer of complexity to the discussion, which maybe adds a positive note. In terms of the actors in the region, of course, Russia is an actor, the US is an actor that has their own interest. And of course, the European Union is fully aware of the risk and also the opportunities of engagement with the US, of course, more than Russia. And I think one example of how the action of the US has an impact also on the European Union is the withdrawal from for multilateral funding for development. Now we are in a situation where we are still assessing what will be the final impact of the withdrawal, because we are still waiting for the final decision. But of course, this has an impact on the situation in the region, on the situation overall, also for the European Union. But we will need to see together within the European Union with the partners, and possibly also in a cross-regional perspective, how we can assess the impact and then tackle the challenges and opportunities together.
If you can comment about another way of Russia's destabilization in African countries, because it's not only disinformation and sabotage, but it's also the presence of Russia's paramilitary groups like Wagner, who were present in Mali and in Niger and in other African countries for years. The same group that was present in Syria also. Would you like to comment about it? Because I think we are lacking in our discussion this point.
Bueno, mi nombre es Sara Mora. Primero, muchas gracias a todos, que ha sido bastante interesante toda la información que nos han compartido. Y bueno, en mi pregunta a la vez quisiera unir un poquito dos ideas que han mencionado ahora, que me han parecido muy interesantes, tanto de Samuel como de Katarzyna. Y bueno, habían mencionado ustedes, sobre todo en un panorama general, que por ahora Europa no podría estar como aislada, ¿sí? Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿cómo se podría construir una Unión Europea más fuerte de lo que es ahora, tomando en cuenta lo que mencionaba Katarzyna, por ejemplo, que decía que no podríamos lograr tanto solos como lo que podríamos hacer en cooperación con otros actores exteriores, es decir, sin que Europa se encuentre demasiado hermética o aislada, y al mismo tiempo aplicar una de las ideas que mencionaba Samuel, que decía, bueno, también que Europa tendría que utilizar todas las herramientas que tiene a su disposición para tomar acción, para tomar decisiones, y al mismo tiempo intentar no separarse de los valores, de la esencia como tal de la Unión Europea. Entonces, mi pregunta va, como ligando estas dos ideas, va inclinada a esto, es decir, en su opinión de ambos, me gustaría conocer la opinión de ambos, ¿cuáles serían como los mecanismos o las posibles acciones que podrían aplicarse para guardar este equilibrio entre una Unión Europea más fuerte y al mismo tiempo fiel a su esencia, que no se pierda esto, porque es una línea muy delgada y al mismo tiempo las dos cosas creo que tendrían una ventaja, tanto una Unión Europea más cooperativa, más abierta, y al mismo tiempo mantenerse fuerte como con su esencia. No sé si me explico un poco.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion. I have a question for Maria Cristina. You mentioned the three macro areas that the new pact is trying to do once, so human development, economics, and peace and stability. And I was wondering if there's going to be some sort of redundancy, perhaps, with also the macro areas that the strategic comprehensive partnerships that the EU has been doing, such as Tunisia, with Egypt, that mainstream migration also of these foreign policy goals, such as economics and development. So I was wondering if they're going to be complementary, or how you're working on creating maybe perhaps new instruments operationally, but also in terms of strategy. And you mentioned opportunities, so I was wondering, in your consultations with partner countries, what are they seeking with this new pact in the Mediterranean with the EU? What opportunities would they like to engage in with the EU? So if you could tell us perhaps a bit more about that from the results of the consultation. Thank you.
We can start answering. Another? Okay.
Is going to take a different stance on cooperation with North African countries when it comes to tackling the migration issue, no? And he or she is asking whether the raise of armament will increase the externalization and securitization of borders, or it's unrelated.
Okay. Please, who starts?
Okay, I don't want to dominate the floor, but I got two questions, so I will try. First with Russia in Africa. Well, absolutely, Russia has been present for years in sub-Saharan Africa, in Mali, Niger, in Sudan, in many different places through Wagner, now Africa Corp, but not just. And this is the same offer that Russia has been giving previously to Assad and now in Libya to Haftar, so basically being a security provider to various authoritarian leaders and fueling instability through helping those authoritarian clients to destabilize their countries and thanks to that profiting in an economic way. So that's well established. Side note, actually, Ukraine has been trying to counter that itself, not always very successfully. For instance, intervention in Mali was very mixed results, but that just shows you the extent to which this is well-known fact that Russia is present in Africa. The EU is not really doing much to counter Russia's presence in Africa right now, not enough for sure. Even though we know how, this is also for our security, this is a big threat. On the international actors and international cooperation, gracias por su pregunta. I think in a way, the change in the way that the US is conducting in international politics right now has actually given the EU opportunity to, whether we'll use it or not, again, it's a different question, but presenting us with opportunity to become this leader of multilateralism and the value of diplomacy and the value of cooperation. For instance, on trade, there's been a lot of controversy about the World Trade Organization and the US criticism. There's been an idea floated that perhaps we can have an alternative to WTO where the US might not be even invited. This is perhaps a little bit more of a play to push our ideas on the US to rethink their ideas. But in general, it just shows you that we don't need to always follow the US in what they do, and we can also lead international cooperation. And I don't think it contradicts our being stronger inside. In fact, the two go together, because multilateralism and diplomacy is at the core of the European project. It doesn't always mean just cooperating with exactly like-minded partners, but it can be like-minded partners. We can try to find ground for cooperation with multiple countries and groupings of countries around the world. So I don't think those two are mutually exclusive.
Thank you so much for the question, and I think it's very interesting because it addresses this tension between the interest and the values of the European Union. And talking about the interest, how we can operate in a more effective way in that regard, when it tackles more the strategic side of the thing, the military side of the thing, the security-based issues. I think here it's a matter of finding or creating, even I don't know, bold in elaborating new and more flexible frameworks in which multilateralism can work in a faster way. For example, we have this issue, we can create some sort of a coalition of the willing, let's say, it's the word that comes up, probably not the right one, but in the sense that do we have countries within Europe, but also at the doorsteps of Europe, in the Gulf, or at the immediate neighborhood of the European Union that see the same threat, that perceive the same threat in the same way, that have the different instruments or even that can be complementary to the European Union instruments to tackle an issue, well, in that case, we can elaborate a new framework and make a clearer sense of what a strategic partner means, because when we look back at the strategic compass elaborated some years ago, we have this reference, very general reference to the strategic partnership for the EU, but then back then China was a strategic partner, Russia was also mentioned as a strategic partner, but then of potential ones. So even redefining these categories to make sense of what can a non-EU member provide for the EU. And in terms of values, I think everything boils down to the matter of conditionalities, in the sense that the EU should really avoid applying double standards to different scenarios that in the end might also be similar or mirror each other in a sense. For example, if you have conditionality for democratic backsliding in certain countries, well, the same conditionalities for the same situation must be applied to other countries. Even when we're talking about membership, for example, well, there were countries in talks for membership for years and years, and now we're talking about enlarging, again, European Union, but it doesn't really seem that we're talking about the so-called Copenhagen criteria, so the acquis communautaire that was a real issue at stake back then. And very quickly, even briefly on the question from home, I don't really see this connection on having this sort of arm race and not focusing on issues like migration. I feel there are issues that are, of course, connected, because if we have wars, well, even a domestic situation of a country might be a push factor for migration to increase in terms of numbers. But as was mentioned before, for example, I think to create some sort of, to align countries on the issue of migration, which is now actually dividing Southern Europe compared to Northern Europe in terms of threat perception, is actually changing the perception of migration from being just a threat to be an opportunity. Because, of course, it represents a threat when it's not manageable just for a certain amount of countries which are geographically closer. But if we then share not just the burden, but also the advantages that a much more controlled migration, or at least better managed migration can actually provide to the European job market and whatever it is, I think also this could change the image of migration as a political issue.
I would like to reply to the question of, what's her name? Francesca. So Francesca, thank you very much for your question. So I'll try to go a little bit in order, because your question was quite articulated. So first, in terms of opportunities that have emerged as part of the consultations. I would say that the interest of the partner countries and of member states is very multifaceted, so it's very broad. It extends to energy, connectivity, infrastructure, digital. Of course, part of the pact will also be the Trans-Mediterranean Energy and Clean Tech Initiative, the so-called TMED. So of course there is a strong also focus in terms of interest in terms of cooperation in the area of energy, connectivity, transport, etc. Now we will see what the initiatives will be about. It's a bit too early to tell you right now, because we are indeed, as I mentioned before, we are in this elaboration phase. And this links a little bit with the second point of your question, which is about the complementarity with bilateral efforts and the strategic and comprehensive partnership. Just to clarify, of course, the strategic and comprehensive partnerships are not migration partnerships. They are based on various pillars that go across political involvement, economic development, socio-economic reforms, people-to-people contact, and also migration. But indeed, it's a bit too early for me to tell you what would be the overlaps now that we don't have the initiatives yet in place. So maybe it's a question I will be happy to reply to you in a few months' time once we have the pact adopted. And in terms of migration, because I see it's a topic that it's really of interest to the audience, so I'm also happy to elaborate a little bit on that. As was mentioned, indeed, migration is a complex phenomenon and underpins a number of different policies. If we think about the three areas that have been pre-identified in the context of the Pact of the Mediterranean, migration in all its different forms, may it be regular, irregular, underpins a little bit the three pillars. If we think about illegal migration, students' mobility, this is something that actually the partner countries have been very interested to. Katarzyna was mentioning the Union for Universities, that it's also something that has been discussed in the context of the consultations. So this is definitely something that it also relates to migration in the broader sense we would like to promote as well. Economies, if we think about the job market, migrants will set up their own business. It's underpinned entrepreneurship, small and medium enterprises. And finally, of course, there is an aspect that it's more security related, if we want, or at least this is how it's depicted, that relates to fight against anti-smuggling and criminal activities that also have a role in countries that unfortunately are not managing fully to tackle this criminal network. So it's just an indicative overview, but of course this will be mainstreamed also throughout the pact. But then indeed we will see on a case-by-case situation how this will be tackled by the initiatives.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if we have time for another question. Do we? Maybe just one, the final one, if there is any other interest. Yes, briefly, because we are running out of time. Thanks.
Szydło, dzień dobry. Simple question. You told us that Russia is paying media in Africa to promote Russian standpoint. Is Europe paying any media in Africa to promote European standpoints?
No, because we don't operate the way that Russia does. And that's our challenge. We try to counter Russian disinformation in different ways. We try to straighten whatever misinformation Russia is spreading. Now every EU delegation has an officer dedicated, Maria Cristina may know better, but every EU delegation has an officer dedicated to not just fighting disinformation, but promoting accurate information about the EU. But our difficulty is that we don't want to operate the same way that Russia does. So we will not be employing the same instruments to fight Russia, which of course affects our effectiveness in many ways, but no, the short answer is no.
Okay, thank you. I think we can wrap up. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists. And thanks for the invitation. Thank you.
Gràcies a tots per la vostra presència aquí durant aquests 3 dies. Donem per conclòs el 5è curs d'estiu Sofía Corradi i per donar-li la benvinguda a l'estiu i per despedir-nos del curs hi ha un petit refrigeri aquí fora i esperem que tots ens pugueu acompanyar. Moltíssimes gràcies.